Check that you have all of your patterns: your front top, back top, outer sleeve, inner sleeve and sleeve cuff, front skirt, back skirt, and skirt ruffle, placket, sleeve ruffle, collar, and collar stand. Mark your dots on your patterns and then sew them up. Repeat for the other patterns. On the front top, mark out the markings according to the paper pattern. Then position the placket panels so that the lines match up. Make sure the placket panels are not overlapping. Matching up and securing the corners will help you sew more accurately later on. Sew 2 parallel lines according to the marking drawn before. Once you're done sewing the 2 parallel lines, when you open them up, the distance between both stitches should be 3 centimeters. Now we're going to cut down right in the center and then the 2 diagonal lines. Let me show you how to fold the placket in. Flipping to the wrong side, push all the seam allowances towards the center front and iron well. Fold the placket into half and iron well. Next, we're going to tuck in the edge. Fold it in by 1 centimeter, making sure it covers the stitch line below, and iron well. On the right side, sew in the ditch where the placket meets the front panel, making sure that you're catching onto the folded edge below. Position the placket so that the right side is over the left side. Flip up the bottom part of the panel and we're going to sew down that tiny little triangle. From one end to the other. When you're done, look at the corners and it should look neat. If it looks folded, that means you've probably sewn too much. Remove your stitches and try again. Sew the front and back top together 1 centimeter at the shoulder. Take the interfaced collar stand and align it to the placket. There should be a 1 centimeter protrusion of the collar stand. Take the other collar stand without the interfacing and sandwich it right on top. We're going to sew these 3 layers together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along the whole neckline. To pin into place, make sure at the start there is the 1 cm protrusion, and then pin the stud down. When you're pinning the other side, make sure that the collar stands are not twisted in any way, and then pin it down as well. Remember the 1 cm protrusion. You may also match up the notches with the shoulder seam and pin that down too. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce the tension. Flip up both collar stand panels and iron well. Next, we're going to sew the collar to the collar stand. Sew the uninterfaced collar stand to the uninterfaced collar. With the right sides together, start the collar from the notch on the collar stand. And then sew all the way down with a 1 cm seam allowance, and repeat this for the other side. With the right sides together, sew the collar ruffle panel together at the short edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowance and then iron well. With the right sides together, fold it into half lengthwise and sew 1 cm at the short edge. Repeat for the other side. Turn it inside out and then fold it into half and iron well. Next, sew 2 rows of parallel gathering stitches at the open edge. Remember to change the stitch length on your sewing machine to 5.0 and do not backstitch. Gently start to gather the fabric to match the length of the collar. Sew the collar ruffles to the collar with a 1 cm seam allowance. Check that the corner of your ruffles are slightly pointed and you are satisfied with how it looks like. If not, the time to redo them would be now. Grab a pair of scissors and trim on the ruffle collar panel to reduce the tension at the corner. Flip down the rest of the fabric so that the collar panels meet one another. Ensure that all the ruffle panels are tucked in. We'll be sewing from the collar stand past the collar and stopping about halfway through. To do the other side, you're going to repeat the same thing. Push all the ruffles inwards and then sew the collar stand, the collar, and then stopping so the fabric sticks out in the center. You'll be sewing them with a 1 cm seam allowance on both sides. When you're done, it will look something like this, where the fabric is sticking out in the center and you've sewn up both sides. Grab a pair of scissors and we're going to trim into the seam allowances to reduce the tension and the bulk. Then, gently pulling the fabric out, you're going to turn the collar and the collar stand inside out. For the opening at the back, hand sew to seal it up. Attach the inner sleeve to the armhole, wrong sides together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the sleeve crown. Attach the outer sleeve to the armhole, right sides together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Gently pull on the gathering stitches to gather the fabric. Most of the gathers should be focused right where the shoulder seam is. Overlock the seam. Sew the top and skirt panels at the waist with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock the seam. On the wearer's right, sew the front and the back together at the side seam with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. On the wearer's left, install a zip from the notch down with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, starting from the notch all the way to the slit opening. Finish up the top and bottom of the zip. At the slit opening, fold in the seam allowance of 1.5 cm and iron well. Then top stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance to hold the seam allowance in place. For the skirt ruffle panel, with right sides together, sew the short edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowance and iron well. With right sides together, fold the panel into half lengthwise and sew the short edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then fold it back and iron well. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch along the open edge. Gently pull the gathering stitch on the skirt ruffle panel to match the length of the skirt hem. Sew both panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Overlock the seam. Flip the ruffle panel down and top stitch on the skirt panel with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. With right sides together, fold the sleeve cuff panel into half and sew along the short edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Spread open the seam allowance and iron well, and then fold it into half with wrong sides together. Iron well. Baste along the open edge of the fabric to seal up the cuff. On the outer sleeve panel, sew 2 rows of gathering stitch along the bottom. Gently pull the gathering stitch to gather the outer sleeve to match the width of the inner sleeve. Baste the inner and outer sleeve panels together. Grab the sleeve cuff, and with the folded side going in first, we're going to sew both panels together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. overlock the seam. Finally, sew on some buttonholes and buttons. And there you have it. Your dress is completed.